ARK 2, the game that we all want but probably won't get for another year or two. However, knowing when we get it is not necessary to theorize about how the game might play out and specifically how its story will work. So in this video, I'm going to take you along the most likely scenarios for ARK 2's story to play out. We'll talk about the role that we as players serve in the story, the possibility for the return of Explorer notes, Santiago starring as some kind of main character, the potential for NPC quests, a voice entry log system, and much more. So without further ado, let's get right into it by figuring out what it is that we know for sure. But before we get into that, go ahead and lovingly caress the like button and subscribe for more of this kind of content. Okay, now here's the video. So first of all, the trailer shows us a couple different things. Notably, there are a few general NPCs who are carrying goods, weapons, and other gear. The little girl, which we still don't know much about beyond the fact that she has an implant, and Mr. Vin Diesel himself playing as Santiago da Costa. Yes, that Santiago from ARK Survival Evolved. Before we get into Santiago and what he's doing here, let's talk a little bit about the potential for us as a main character, who we are even, and what role we might have in ARK 2. Let's go before that even, though. How do we spawn into the game? Well, I actually predicted exactly how Genesis 2's spawning in system would work. I theorized right after the end of Gen 1 that we'd spawn into Genesis 2 whenever it came out in a cutscene, getting dragged by Rockwell's tentacle and maybe thrown into the station or something. I was pretty close, with HLNA instead being our savior, but I think it's safe to say that we will experience a similar cutscene in ARK 2, and here's why. First, Wildcard knows that they can make cool cutscenes now, so that's something. But secondly, what was the last thing that happened in ARK Survival Evolved? The event that takes us right into ARK 2? Well, it's this scene, which I'm sure you've seen 1,000 times by now. Santiago is crashing down, but instead of focusing on him, look over there, those pods, there's a lot of them. Each one is carrying at least one survivor who is either in a sleeping chamber or just fell out of it like our lovely Santiago. So presumably our characters are in these pods. ARK 2 may begin as we are crashing down onto the planet and wake up in our little pods, naked, well, except for our undies, and afraid, mostly, unless you have like 10,000 hours in ARK, then you're just kind of excited. But nonetheless, I can imagine this being similar to the start of Subnautica, the original. In case you haven't played that game, here's a small clip from its beginning cutscene. Okay, so let's say we crack open our pod, and breathe the fresh air of the ARK 2 planet. Then what? Well, in order to figure out how the story might work, let's consider my theory number 1, which is about the medium the story will be told in. First up is Explorer notes. Now, first, I mean, is it likely that ARK 2 will even carry on the legacy of having these scattered notes all over the place that people have to seek out in order to hope to understand what is effectively a story told only with journal entries and sketches? I'm gonna say no, probably not. At least not in a way that gives it huge importance. And to understand why I say this, we need to go back, way back, to the somewhat distant past of ARK's development and story medium. ARK 1's story was never a huge focus within the community. I say this because it took like 3+ years after the game came out for people to really begin raising questions about the lore and the overarching story. Videos from channels like Anthomnia, Kona Voice, Ninja Killer, Complete Games, and even this guy called Neddy the Noodle? Kind of sounds like a weird guy, had actually gotten a couple more people invested into the lore than there would be otherwise. I stand by this argument, not to give myself a lot of credit here, but because I've genuinely seen the lore community expand massively since the ARK lore has seen an increase in coverage. And it isn't just people over on YouTube. You can look all around the community to find artworks made by fans who have drawn characters like Lee Mei Yin, Helena Walker, Edmund Rockwell, and so on. This is all to say that the story medium of ARK Survival Evolved was never really a massive focus by the developers, at least from the island to Extinction, because that medium that they chose to tell it was fundamentally, it sucked, okay? It sucked a little. I'm sorry, Mark and the artist, I will explain. Listen, Mark Soskin's writing is fantastic. It's great. He's a fantastic writer, and he also went on to make this really cool visual novel game called Henchman Story. However, Wildcard chose the medium for his storytelling to be in the form of a collectible, which already targets a very niche audience. Furthermore, the collectible in question, the Explorer notes, which are scattered in little boxes, containers, and random locations around the map, are both very difficult to track down and simultaneously appear to be a bit unappealing to the general gaming audience. For the most part, I've seen ARK players play the game for the mechanics, gathering, the farming, the taming, fighting bosses, PvP, PvE, all that, but rarely have I seen collecting all of the Explorer notes and reading them all as a genuinely big reason that people play the game.
Is it called two times boost, isn't it? Something like that? I know that they do that, but I mean, I haven't read them if that's what you're asking.
Those people do exist, including myself and many others within my own Discord community, which you can join with a link in the pinned comment. However, they do not make up the majority, and thus, to get to the point, they represent a small percentage of players. This is bad. I mean, kinda. If you're a developer who wants your players to be excited about the story, you need to be targeting as many people as possible. Hopefully a majority, and not a tiny minority of people who like to collect notes.
What I do is I like to 100% games, right? But for the Explorer notes, right, that's one of my favorite parts so far, and I haven't even gotten a chance to read very many of them yet.
While smaller communities may feel more connected, it is just true that a game's story is going to get more exposure if the medium the game delivers it in appeals to as many players as possible. ARK 2 needs to live up to the expectations. Wildcard knows that, and I'm sure they want to deliver. And so I believe it is very likely that they will look at ARK Survival Evolved, realize that the Explorer Note system, as it was, relied heavily on the community itself to popularize them visually with videos and fan art, audibly with readings and voiceover in order to even be understood and read by a larger audience. And thus, they will adapt ARK 2's story in a different direction to accomplish said goal. I guess we'll see when the game comes out, but I genuinely believe this. So that begs the question then. If Explorer Notes are phased out in ARK 2, what will replace them? How's the damn story gonna work if we don't have to spend like 50 hours clawing our f***ing eyes out trying to find meshed Explorer Notes on Genesis 2? That is what this video is for. Okay, so how will it actually work then? Well, first I'll start by mentioning the role of a certain character. Santiago seems to be important in ARK 2, unless it was purely for promotional material, but I don't think that's the case. This may make him an NPC that you interact with, do quests with, and play with in the open world. Maybe after you get out of the pod you crash in, if that is in fact the way we start the game, you find Santiago shortly after and take quests from him. If not this, it may be the case that Santiago is merely a pillar for some NPC community that you can run into and interact with. I mean, he seems like a bit of a leader in the ARK 2 teaser trailer, standing out as some kind of tribal war chief to protect everyone. The only issue that I see with ARK's story going in this direction is that quests that include interactable NPCs or, God forbid, settlements can tend to make a game more linear, you might say. ARK Survival Evolved had a lot of freedom because although the story wasn't easy to understand because it was in the form of a collectible, this also made it unimposing. It gave you more freedom to do whatever you wanted and not be limited to having to follow some story. If you as a survivor wanted to understand the story, you'd have to go out of your way to explore, collect notes, or just research it on YouTube and on the wiki. If ARK 2 has quests, NPCs, factions, anything like that, it will be difficult to pull off without turning the game into something fairly linear, especially given that there is the issue with what happens when you kill NPCs, or what happens when you make them invincible instead. In my opinion, making them unkillable takes away from immersion a little bit, as seen in examples like the Traitors of 7 Days to Die, or NPCs in a Fallout game which can't be killed because they have importance to that linear story progression. I'm not saying ARK 2 will be an RPG, that may be a bit of a disaster if it were, but I am saying that implementing these systems implies a bit of RPG stuff along with it, and thus NPC quests may not be the right approach unless pulled off in a way that retains the open world freedom that ARK 1 had and that ARK 2 seems to be going for. I honestly don't think it's possible to implement this level of complexity when we're dealing with a multiplayer open world game of this style. For the most part, I'm gonna put this theory down and not touch it unless we have good reason to think otherwise. Okay, so now you're probably still wondering, how in the hell is ARK 2's story going to work? If Explorer Notes are unlikely, and quests with interactable NPCs seem too daunting of a task to put into this type of game, what else is there? Enter Fallout 76. I wish I was joking. Now, I haven't played Fallout 76 that much, so please do keep this in mind, but I do know a bit about it, especially because of the whole bug issue disaster. I will say this. ARK 2 may implement a combination of the Explorer notes and a quest system that could be more easily pulled off through notes that are read to the survivor and are implemented into environmental storytelling, which, by the way, ARK's map creators kinda suck at. I'm sorry, okay, I still love your game, but I will never forgive you for the element extractor. Ahem. Anyways, in Fallout 76, you find all these note entries with voice acting all around the game world, and you basically pick up these little quests along with them. The notes are found in the form of little tapes. Not only that, but the notes are implemented into environmental storytelling. I mean, look at the environment I found this log entry in.
Leaving this message to inform the Parks and Rec Department of the horrible experience my family and I had this week, but between the constant shaking in the cabins, rodent swarms, and before they saw the picture frames spinning on the walls.
Anyways, my point is that this could be done in a similar way fairly easily within a multiplayer setting, which ARK 2 will have. This could mean client-side story-based activities that are engaging, but not so engaging that you need interacting instance-based NPCs to pull it off. However, there's one big issue with this. Why would there already be log entries in the planet right after you, the survivor, have woken up? Don't people need time to leave these logs? I mean, they didn't just immediately start spitting out stories as soon as they all popped out of their pods, right? I've thought of a way we deal with that too, so hear me out. This is my own proposal for what ARK 2's story is going to actually look like. A prediction, if you will. Okay, so you, as the survivor, will wake up a good while after the others. We're not talking like decades or even centuries after you do in ARK 1's story, just maybe a few years. Your pod crashed in a specific way where you were put into stasis, and perhaps it kept you alive with whatever energy it had stored or was able to extract from the sun or the planet in some kind of stasis. Either that, or maybe you were just shot down off the Genesis ship into the planet a little bit late. Anyways, eventually something compromises your pod, maybe it falls down off a mountain from erosion, and you're finally awoken, only to realize that it had been months or even a few years after the others already crashed onto the planet and started living in the game world. So you get out of your pod and begin finding logs, not Explorer notes exactly, but other ways to drip feed the story through logs that are actually voiced by characters similar to examples like Subnautica and Fallout 76, like I mentioned. Through this storytelling, you'll follow these voiced logs to pick up quests that maybe take you into different locations, caves, and other areas around the planet to give you an overarching story that you genuinely feel like you're a part of, as opposed to just finding some dusty old notes, which are apparently enchanted with magical f***ing powers to survive death rays from the sun and never get wet from being flooded with water despite being made out of paper, or teleportation notes with a f***ing Nova that you have to manually read. I know, so hard for us gamers, in order to even begin to understand in whatever order that you read them in. The voice acting could really bring this to life, and I think these kinds of more client-side quests that maybe even act similar to the Genesis 2 missions could be really engaging. Each one could take you to another and further progress your understanding of the story, as it humanizes different survivors who also crash in pods and were still alive at least a few years prior. This may take us to different biomes on the planet, and ultimately it could bring us to understand what the antagonist of the game will actually be. Will Rockwell return? No, probably not, but I'm sure that it will be an equally intimidating antagonist, and I'm sure that we have a lot to look forward to. So ultimately we talked about Explorer notes, what Santiago might have to do with the story, the possibility for quests, and what I think is the most likely scenario for a storytelling medium, the voiced note entry quests that have historically been implemented well in other similar kinds of survival-focused games. Thank you all so much for watching this video and considering my ideas for how ARK 2's story is going to work in the first place. I've been wanting to make a few more videos covering ideas around ARK 2's lore, so stay tuned for the next one, where I'll be going over the whole no tech thing, how that might be implemented into the story, what Santiago's real goals are, the return of Nita, and what in the actual f*** these things are. As always, if you haven't already, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe for more ARK content. Take care, everyone, and as always, good luck, survivors.